I've done this now so many times over the previous days with all the functions, but I'll say yet again how pleased I am to have Christopher Quinn come to Abu Dhabi. We've known each other for many years. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His first film, which we showed last night, God Grew Tired of Us, about the Lost Boys of Sudan, won the Grand Jury Award and the Audience Award at Sundance, and the following year he was awarded the Best Outstanding Emerging Documentary Filmmaker. He did the American version of the British series 21 and Up, following the lives of people from the age of 5 to 7 to 12 to 21. Amazing work. And he's someone who takes a long time deciding on what he wants to commit to. And when he commits so fully and movingly, as you'll see tonight. And the funny story he told about this particular film in one of the classes we were talking in today was that in this instance, whereas often the work you want to do is something you have an idea about, in this case, he gets a call from Natalie Portman and Jonathan Safran Foer, the author of the book upon which this movie is based, saying, we know your work, and we would love you to make a documentary based on Jonathan's book. And Christopher's first response was, you have the wrong guy. I really like a big juicy steak. But they said, that's no problem. And he was given the book and he read the book. And having read the book and then met with Jonathan Safran Foer, the author, he found his mind already changing and that he wanted to go on a journey of discovery. And as I say to my students all the time, the best storytelling comes out of you giving us, the reader, back your journey of discovery rather than coming at us with what you think you know. And Christopher's a real talent at giving back the discovery, as you'll see in this movie. This is really the journey, but he does it through these multiple voices that you're about to witness. So without further ado, as you'll see, we're going to do a Q&A afterwards, but this is an artist of real passion and compassion. So I'm going to introduce him briefly to come up and say a few words, and then we'll have the Q&A afterwards. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Charles. Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming to watch my film. It's been a wonderful set of days here already, and I've enjoyed meeting so many people. So I'll be brief, and we're going to get together afterwards. So this is a culmination of 5 or 6 years of my life, and sometimes it was watching the grass grow, and other times it was moving faster than I could keep up. But I hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back afterwards to discuss it. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Christopher, for that. 2 nights in a row. I've seen these movies many times, but 2 nights in a row being brought to such emotion. I'd like to open this to a Q&A. I'm just going to start with my cue, and to get things rolling. You had said in one of our previous conversations here in the last couple of days that when you first sat down with Jonathan Safran Foer, the author, he said you can do what you want with the book. And you found that very liberating. And it's so interesting to me, stylistically and just the authorial choices, that the only character in the movie from his book is Frank Reitz.
Yeah.
And then you went out and found everyone else and then did this amazing, this movie is just this ensemble where you're just going back and forth, juggling. So talk about how you came to that and why you did it that way.
Well, thanks for coming, by the way. One of the things that I thought was really important was to see the individuals kind of in the long shadow of factory farming, to see how the individuals are affected, not just the animals, which is apparent, and you can see in the CAFOs, those confined feeding operations, but what it's doing collectively, no matter what lens you wanted to look through, whether it was for your own human health, or if it was from animal suffering, or the idea of environmental degradation, that each individual had to kind of represent one of those lenses. And so that was an important thing to me. But also to see kind of like Frank Reese, the turkey farmer, and then Craig Watts, and to see that America prides itself on this patch quilt of independent American farms, and that had all gone away by the time I started to tack across the country. And really to see that it was also a depletion of spirit, that there's these large pools of former farming communities that don't have that way of life anymore. And so it's not, the system itself works for just a few corporations, which they profit greatly from, but collectively, I think we all lose. And all of that is to say that this also has such an enormous weight on the environment, which is going to be an issue that we're going to have to face with South Asia and East Asia starting to adopt the so-called Western diet. That meteoric rise in meat consumption there is leading to more and more animals being produced to raise fast food and other quick meals that include meat, cheese, and dairy. We're in a real problem. And if we continue, we're going to have to go from 50 billion animals to 100 billion animals by 2050. And the environment already can't take and support what we're asking of it. I guess that answers, I hope it answers. All those were variables in deciding on who was going to be in the film and representing the various aspects of those lenses.
A set of question asked of the person who invented cottage cheese. How did he or she know that they were finished? How'd you know where to stop with your research? This goes to China, it goes to India. How many years was this?
It was quite a bit of time, and it was also to get the narrative shape of, of time, which is, Jim Keane, when I first met him, was in this moment of crisis and his family didn't survive it. And Craig Watts waiting to see that decision where he had that breaking point, but also that kind of willful moment where he says that great line out of nowhere one day when we were recording him, where he said, you really make a choice, the self-empowerment for this guy who had no power, that you make a choice of what you put on your plate. And that kind of reshaped his whole way. And now he heads out and he talks to other commodity farmers about being able to quit and how to do it. And we wanted to go that long and make sure that we saw the course through these various people that are in there, that there was real change in shape with what was going on.
Yeah, I'd like to. Someone's going to run a mic to you. I was told we have to wait until the mic goes to the person.
Thank you for coming, Christopher. We do appreciate what you just showed us. One question. I would like to know what you hope to achieve when you the moment you decided to go on this trip to make this film. And today, is there a difference between what you hope to achieve and what you have achieved so far and what you think this film can do?
Well, I think it's a beginning, just to answer the back end of that conversation, I think it's the beginning of having a dialogue that we all have to have. I think we know that we can't consume meat on the level, at least the way that Western cultures have consumed meat. And there's a way of stepping forward into the future where, look, I'm pretty practical about it. There's, on the sides of the spectrum, there's the hearty meat eater and then there's the vegan abolitionist. And there are those two sides. And I think there's some real empowerment of saying, if you just pulled back from eating meat 1 or 2 times a week, it would have this radical effect. If everybody did that on the planet, then we would start to see the reversal of the environmental degradation and less animals suffering and confinement and your own human health. There's a whole issue of consuming too much meat. We now know there's definitive arguments that saying consuming a lot of meat is really not good for your own human and social health. So, and then the first part, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question?
I didn't ask in a clear way. So my main point was, did what you hope to achieve when you start, let's say, filming changed between then and now, after your research, after the whole trip, after the feedback that you have from the impact of the film?
Yeah, I mean, well, the feedback's been wonderful. We've been able to go all over the place in Europe, in the United States, and also in Australia. We go to China in June with it. And I think everybody cares about it. It's amazing. I mean, there's not anybody that doesn't care. Nobody wants to see an animal suffer for their meal. I think it's, in the United States, it's 98% of people have an issue with that. But yet we've designed a system that is in place that causes more suffering than any time in human history. And I think there's ways of moving forward, and I think it's a conversation. And I think it's not just my film. There'll be multiple other films that have to tell this story, but it's really about informing. Like, I didn't know. I thought I was a really good consumer, and I was getting my meat, eggs, and dairy, and the catchphrases all seemed to sing to me, and I was able to feel good about the meal I was putting on my family's plate. But in reality, when I started to look under the hood of factory farming and how we raise our food, it just turned everything upside down. And so that was the takeaway for me, is I just wanted to share what I learned on this journey.
Thank you.
Yes?
You know, so Super Size Me was one that came out some time ago, and I'm just curious. I mean, I think one of the things that comes to mind is that it's something that you bring up in the film, is it's so much larger than the topic itself, right? I mean, in other words, it's not simply about scaling back, which is important, but about, it's systemic, right? So that the production of meat is part of the larger production of, it's a profit industry, for-profit industry. So you know, it's one thing to say that we want to really, by focusing on this industry, to talk about health issues and, you know, animal cruelty issues and you know, sort of try to cut back on that. But the larger question has to do with sustainable development the world over, and about a capitalist economic model, right, of which this kind of work and farming is a part. So unless one changes or one calls attention to the systemic problem, I'm not sure how symptomatically we can go about, you know, dismantling one part of the problem rather than the whole thing. And I'm thinking particularly here, and I wondered if I was going to ask you if a book called, by Ruth Ozeki, who's a Japanese-American writer and also documentary filmmaker at time, wrote a book called My Year of Meats, and which takes that problem on in a very interesting way. I wondered if you came across that in your research, and whether you also heard about the ways in which a lot of the meat ingestion and exposure to, you know, the kind of stuff that happens in these farms is affecting people who live in them in terms of horribly severe bodily changes. So that, for example, girls younger than 9 are menstruating and growing huge breasts before they're even 9. I mean, 4 or 5-year-olds. DES, which was used, you know, years earlier to the 70s, caused reproductive damage to women's systems. So, I mean, has that made its way? You know, that opens it up to so much more, right? A very much larger critique of the damage that's being done.
Sure. Well, it's a massive subject, right? And with 90 short minutes to tell it. it becomes difficult. And that's why I always encourage, and there's other filmmakers right now. There's one called Game Changers that's coming out that is a very pro all veg diet. And I've been supporting the filmmaker in that. There's a lot to cover in a little amount of time. Social health is a big and significant one, and we poured through and did a lot of research on it. And meat consumption, I think the United States just called it a carcinogenic. So they're basically saying meat is not good for you and you should cut back. Meantime, you have the same government who's artificially subsidizing cheap meat. So you have chicken that as soon as those subsidies went away, that business that you see, that house of cards, would just collapse immediately. But people think there's cheap chicken. 80% of the meat that we raise in the United States goes to fast food. So you get a 99-cent burger. But when you actually externalize all those costs, they add up rather quickly, especially the taxpayers' money pays for that cheap chicken, so you pay for it one way or another. You also have the healthcare costs that are astronomical. We're seeing this in South Asia, where meat consumption in the inner cities is starting to happen at a rapid rate, and all of a sudden you have a huge rise in type 2 diabetes and heart disease. So we know these are real problems. And the environment is just completely taxed on so many levels. And you have to argue, you can grow a sweet pea that is a protein source that's very rich, especially if you isolate it. And you can get, that could be a very good protein source. Instead of growing that sweet pea and then feeding it to an animal, you're doubling the system. So there's all these conversations that need to start to take place, but we have to change. This is basically a film about a system that is completely bankrupt and ultimately is going to fail. And it's just a matter of time, and it will. I can say with great confidence that factory farming will ultimately fail.
Thank you very much for continuing this conversation through your film, which it's a conversation that's been going on for a long time. I think of one of the books that I teach in one of my courses, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which causes great uproar about the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the early 1900s. And he famously said that I tried to hit people in the heart, but I got them in the stomach, because what he influenced people to start worrying about the food that they were consuming. And when I was watching this extraordinary film tonight, I started thinking, well, I'm going to become a vegetarian, or I'm going to eat meat more responsibly. But then I began to think, well, what about public policy? And it seems to me that going to that point earlier, it is a systemic problem. And I'm wondering, as influential as this personally has been to many of the viewers, I'm sure, have you seen some sort of influence for people organizing, for people continuing this conversation and pressuring the governments, our leaders, no, our rulers, I hesitate to call them our leaders, because let's be honest, they're more rulers than anything. But what has been the influence of this conversation on that larger discussion?
Well, things are starting. I mean, I would say it has a long way to go, but case in point, one of the experts that's in there who runs the Good Food Institute is a perfect example. That's a organization that now sits on Capitol Hill. It's walking distance to all the senators and also very specially to the committee that makes all these decisions. And they are putting real pressure. They're starting to apply real pressure. And that's just coming from a change. There's a lot of people who believe, especially in the industry itself, not the meat industry, but some of the capitalists and entrepreneurs mainly in the tech sector, really believe of moving away from it. And there's another organization that is trying to, has stopped over $1 trillion of investment dollars going in to factory farm systems that are popping up in South Asia, Africa, and China. And he's convinced them on a grand level not to invest because his whole argument is that it's a risky venture supporting factory farming. And eventually, if you look at the numbers, your investment will fail. And so that sort of dialogue is starting to take place, but it is really, it's not, doesn't have the muscle to get to where we need to go, but it's a beginning. And all of that's starting to take place. And what's really encouraging is, like in the United States, Burger King, Carl's Jr., these are fast food companies, have adopted Beyond Meat burgers. And now Burger King just announced their new Whopper is 100% vegetable-based. So I wouldn't have thought that when I started. I thought, you know, if somebody told me that, I would have laughed. And now here it's starting to happen. And that meat substitute, I don't know if you've ever had it, but it's almost impossible to taste the difference between a burger, commodity burger, and that Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger. And if you want a quick fix for protein, why not get it from, you know, Canadian yellow peas instead of animals that are on a dry lot, 175,000 crammed in and fighting for their lives while you know, antibiotics are being put into them. So there's like really, I think it's starting to happen. It's really, I'm actually very optimistic and encouraged by some of the stuff that's taking place. Change your diet? Massively. Yeah, because when Natalie and Jonathan came to me, I confessed, I said, you got the wrong guy. We were talking about that earlier, and I said, you know, I kind of like to eat meat, and they said, that's fine, that's okay. And it didn't take but more than a year of being out on the road and with commodity, you know, farming to convince me to go the other way. I have to say that I did that very subjective bit about the dairy, and I was just slack jaw when I actually saw where so-called, you know, organic milk was coming from. And that was really the first to go for me was dairy. But now, you know, I wouldn't call myself a vegan, but I'm probably about a 98% vegan. And occasionally, like Alice Waters in San Francisco hosted the event and had Frank, and I happily ate his turkey. But that's the last time I've had turkey, and that's been a while ago. So yeah, it changed my family's eating patterns. Yeah.
Because he thought I was trying to turn him into a vegetarian. Maybe there's some truth in that. I would like my family and friends to watch this. So where is this film available?
Well, it had a theatrical release and in the United States, and it's just been released on Amazon, Hulu, iTunes, Xbox, weird enough, I don't know if you want to watch it. So it's out there, and then it will go into Netflix as soon as we have a theatrical in the UK. That's going to be happening starting in June, and then Germany and France. And once those cycles of theatrical happen, then it will be released on Netflix internationally. So,
could I ask,
yeah.
Why is it that moving away from meat, all of the proposals are to imitate meat-looking products? How is it that we can transition when the visual remains the same? And I'm curious about that for other products as well, like faux fur. Don't we need a complete mind shift?
Well,
would that be useful?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting that happened to me is I just had a complete mind shift by going to the source and seeing how horrific it was, and stopped eating chicken, you know, almost immediately. And for me, I just kind of eat whole foods. That's what I choose to do now. I don't necessarily need a Beyond Burger, but I'll eat a Beyond Burger, and I'll have people over and we'll eat a Beyond Burger. And it's actually not that, for me, I thought this is impossible. I'm never going to be able to give up eating meat. And the fact that I'm sitting here on a stage in Abu Dhabi and saying that I don't really eat meat is short of a miracle. So if anybody can do it, I think there's just a shift away from, you know, the Western diet really placed meat front and center. And in the United States, that's always been the case since since it colonized, because it was just so easy to grow animals. But I don't know the answer to like shifting over, except for I think there's something really, Ethan Brown, who was the guy that did the plant-based alternative burgers, when I was following him around, he was going to these like Taco Bell, these big meat companies. He's like, just put 20% of my plant-based into your taco. And it's here to the cost. And the companies love the cost because it's really inexpensive, especially when you scale up. So they like that idea. They really like, they're in business. But it's also, there's trapped somewhere in there is somebody that really wants the authentic thing, the all beef burger. And then to extend, and I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think people want a simulation of what they formerly ate. And eventually that just goes away. I mean, that's what ends up happening, I think. But, I don't think there's any problem with eating a veggie burger. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for this. Actually, this is what we need, the power of film, because no matter how many books are there or how many we are trying, I teach sustainability and I teach these topics, but it's always films and movies that can really reach people, more people, and impact them. My comment is only, I didn't see much focus here on climate change. And the point is the social concerns and the cruelty against animals and people's health and all these issues are being, addressed. But maybe the climate change thing is the thing that would maybe at the end force us to take action now, because this is in terms of global warming and the emissions, meat production is the number. I think it's the most important action that we do in order to reduce emissions is to reduce meat consumption. So I didn't see much focus in your, or did I miss?
Well, we covered it. I mean, we said that, raising meat for consumption is either arguably one or two, in the lineup of contributors to climate change. So we did cover that section. And I feel like climate change is always omnipresent in the film. But, it's interesting to hear that perspective. For me, it's a big deal. In fact, Jonathan's new book, which is going to get released, in a month, is about the focus, and we talked about a lot about this, is to refocus on how you can tune your diet and specifically change the way our environment is going. So the problem is that the story is so enormous and the systems are so massive in place. It's in order to address in an 80 or 90-minute film, it becomes very complicated and difficult. And that's why I've always encouraged and said wherever I go, start making more films about our food systems, because they have to completely be replaced. Just like a lot of systems, there's Ethan Brown's dad, who is a professor at McGill in Canada, and I was talking with him, and he said, really all the systems have to now be rejiggered, whether they're financial systems or food systems, and the planet has to be front and center. And in order to make or develop any system, really the planet's health has to be the #1 priority, because that's kind of where we are right now. And I learned it, by spending 6 years on the road looking into it. But there's no shortage. I mean, we had a half an hour on the ocean and the depletion of the species on the ocean, and it was massive section that we just ended up having to pull out because I think our film was probably about 4.5 hours. So there's a lot of material that hit the floor that I would love to
very well
have back up there.
And I like the mentioning of biodiversity and how, the monoculture thing, and this was really,
Yeah, well, the UN just released that big finding, right? 10-year study, and they said, how do we feed the world moving into the future? And all their experts concluded that it's going back to multicultural small farms is actually a really healthy way to feed the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that was really powerful about the film is just how deeply felt how all of your interlocutors are. I mean, just the deep emotion that they articulated, the openness, the sincerity, and I mean, in common with the film last night, you have people who just seem to be so natural in front of a camera and so willing to reveal tragedies and the deepest emotions. And I just wondered, as a filmmaker, how you help people arrive at that point, what it takes to make a film like this, and also the toll that it takes on you. How do you, as a filmmaker, sustain yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, thanks for saying that. We've talked a lot. We did a master class the other day, and then we talked to 2 classes today. And what I've spent a lot of time doing is not spending time with the individuals, but before the camera ever comes around. And I spent probably about a year with the individual people and getting to know them and building up what I always say is mutual trust and admiration. And once that gets there, and you know, people are giving themselves over to you to tell their story, but you know, editorially you're omniscient and you can say whatever you want to say. And I think it's your really responsibility as a storyteller or a filmmaker or a writer to give them a sense that they are in good hands. And that's when that ease starts to come, because it's a developed friendship that people start to say what they want to say. And those candid moments I always look for in films, and so I strive to, as a filmmaker, to have those in there, because I'm a firm believer that the individual, you know, up against the rest of the world is the way to, that's the magic of cinema for me, is like you can place an individual and his experience will tell you so much more about the world, whether it's a Sudanese refugee who comes for relative safety in the United States, and then we see the United States in a completely different way. So that's just the kind of filmmaking I like to do. And then you know, a lot of the times, just like, you know, the woman was saying about her husband, sometimes I don't want to know about these things because they're hard to face. And, you know, this took a real toll because I kind of looked under the hood, and now anytime I go out to eat, I just kind of make an assessment of the food that's in front of me, and I wish it was simpler. And then you just have, like with the Lost Boys of Sudan, it was a real emotional journey for me. And I'm happy I tell these stories, and I don't think I would do anything else, but it does over time, you know, just start to, you wish the world was in a better place, yeah.
I just got word we have to shut down. Like, a quick last question.
Okay.
Yeah, I meant to ask you how you see the organic farming, for instance, as a possible answer to continuing raising animals and eating some meat, but not so much, and just having the organic.
Yeah, so Frank, that's the oldest genetic line of turkeys in the United States, and some would argue the world. It's 120 years old, so you can taste what turkey tasted like way back when. I think, and his birds sell, they sell out. There's nobody, like I think as many as he can make, they are bought and sold. And they're really expensive. But the idea, that argument that meat always was expensive. And when I grew up in Virginia, we would eat meat maybe once a week, and my mom would make a soup out of the remains, and but we didn't eat a lot of meat, and that only really changed in the late 70s, where fast, convenient meat came into our diet. It's only 40 or 50 short years that we kind of adapted and changed this way. But I think if you are going to eat meat, and I don't, you really should go and find the source. So I have 2 boys at home that love burgers. They don't get to eat them very often. But I found a farmer in Connecticut who has a small herd, but really takes care of his animals, loves his animals, and then renders one every once in a while, and he'll call me up, and I'll get some, meat to make a burger for them on occasion. But it's really expensive. And I think if everybody kind of adapted that way, there's like this idea of right for, meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner it's not even who we are biologically. We didn't eat meat that way. So it's a real head scratch. I don't know how we got here.
Christopher, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Nice to